I think, the things that probably made this conversation happen in the first place are probably the first metrics you got to have. So it probably has something to do with revenue, and probably secondly has to do with how quality they think the pipeline is filled with opportunities. Your initial metrics that would say this is working or not working really have to start there. And it may be 2 or 3 steps removed from some of the, inside marketing measurements that might be there. But at the end of the day, that's what will kind of matter to them. And so what is, the pipeline contribution looking like? What kind of opportunity creation rate is happening, revenue influence, those kinds of things I think are components that matter when we talk about revenue and pipeline is, are we actually contributing to the financial success of the organization?
With the rapid advancement of AI, machine learning, changing market dynamics, market uncertainty, and more competition entering the ecosystem all the time, B2B marketers are confronted with more challenges than ever before. Another one of those challenges includes tightened budgets and even tighter deadlines. With this in mind, how can B2B marketing teams achieve more with less and still deliver exceptional outcomes? Welcome to this episode of the B2B Marketers on the Mission podcast, and I'm your host, Christian Klepp. Today, I'll be talking to Jordan Buning, who will be answering this question. He's the principal and senior account executive at DDM Marketing and Communications, who's committed to doing great things with incredible people inside and outside the company. Tune in to find out more about what this B2B marketer's mission is. Okay, Mr. Jordan Buning, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Really looking forward to this conversation, Jordan. I should have recorded the last couple of conversations that we had. And that in itself should have been the episode already, right? But I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I had a great chat with your colleague, Joanne, and, we're going to talk about a topic today that you and I both know it keeps coming up, and you ask 50 people out there and they'll give you 50 different answers to this question, right? So let's just dive right in. I'm going to say you're on a mission to help B2B companies deliver high-impact marketing campaigns that drive measurable results. But I'd like to focus on this following topic for today's conversation, and we've got plenty to unpack from this one. How small marketing teams can optimize campaigns to reduce waste and achieve outsized outcomes. Probably I should highlight, bold, italic, underline that outsized outcomes, because that one's going to be the interesting one. Let's kick off the conversation with the following questions, and I'm happy to repeat. So, why do you think many B2B organizations are spending less on their marketing efforts and shortening the timelines in which teams need to deliver results? And based on those constraints, in your experience, where have you seen many marketing teams struggle?
Well, you're right. There's a lot there, and trying to consolidate all of my thoughts down is a unique challenge. But I think part of it is not that marketing is losing importance sometimes in various circumstances, be it budgetary or otherwise, but it's more about the pressure of reshaping how it gets evaluated. There is a lag, I think, in terms of how a lot of individuals perceive the importance and the contribution that marketing makes to the organization's goals and ultimately to its bottom line. So if it's disconnected, it becomes a variable, and a variable that, while maybe nobody is really wishing for it, sometimes becomes minimized or expendable, and therefore it's really kind of a big push. And there's certainly a variety of things that may be driving that. It could be, their own economic uncertainties. Their market has changed, therefore they're making their adjustments. They're managing risk when they're doing some of those kinds of things. They may not necessarily see, again, that relationship between what they're attributing to the bottom line. They may have measurements that are not aligned to show performance, and not that it isn't, but they don't have the data that's doing that, and or they may even have a lag. They may have a lot of information, but it's historical data and present realities may be slightly different, and they don't really have a way to connect to it. And then you've got a lot of other circumstances like shift towards more immediate revenue. They may be saying, well, let's just push out. Let's let's push more on the sales side of this. Let's work with partners and let's have them facilitate the process. And we're going to get out of the sales and marketing role. Maybe what they say is we're going to park acquisition and we're going to really go after account expansion. So those are all things that could be driving all of this. Then you throw in things like AI, where they might say, it looks like there's a lot of great tools out there. Why don't we use more of those? Let's use that to fill the gap where we maybe don't have the resources that we once had. So those all become drivers in the whole situation, and somewhere in between is reality. One other thing may be, a lot of organizations, depending on where they are, probably got where they were without maybe marketing being one of the primary drivers. Maybe they had a great engineering solution, they're a great production organization, and maybe even a great selling organization, but marketing hasn't been something that has necessarily been invested in as great. They got there in their minds through other things. And so there's suddenly a shift in terms of how to reconcile the value that marketing is contributing to the whole thing. And so it's both an opportunity and a challenge. Obviously, in the moment, it's difficult and it's painful. But those are some of the circumstances that are kind of going on. Then, based on constraints, where do we think marketing teams struggle? I had to remind myself of the question, so I wrote it down. If I were to zoom out, I think the core struggle is somewhat capability and capacity, but it's really kind of more the issue of time horizon that they might be running into. Depending on what the issues are that are getting brought up, there could be a bit of a strategy whiplash where they had a plan and the best laid plan has gone to waste. And there's suddenly kind of a push towards a very different effort. And so the investment now is getting either tabled or stalled. And suddenly they're wanting to switch horses and go to a different direction. And obviously from a marketing standpoint, that fear is great. We've got lots of activity. We're doing a bunch of other things. We feel good about that. The other side of it is there's a cost to losing that momentum of where you were going before, and how do you kind of reconcile that, and then how do you avoid continuing to have strategy change after strategy change along the way. Those are the things that really could create constraints out of very small marketing teams, maybe a team of one, maybe an outsourced resource. Those things all get really kind of challenging. Over-reliance on performance metrics and tactics. So, specifically getting into things that seem to have the most immediate ROI. Let's just go after the search campaign conversions. Let's go after some other things that are low funnel, without maybe reconciling the understanding that you're doing that sometimes at the expense of the things that initiate things into the funnel as well. And so, maybe creating a bit of a short-term bump, but at the expense of long-term success as well. So that's a challenge. Confusion with sales and marketing forever being sometimes perceived as opposing parties. So, again, I think this idea of we just need better leads, we just need more quality, whatever, faster, kind of a thing, as opposed to let's be very team-minded and intentional in terms of working together. Measurement paralysis, that's another one that can happen where everybody's got data and you're overwhelmed with that data, and you get so focused looking in the rearview mirror, you're losing track of the direction you're supposed to be going all along. And then you get into some things like short-term wins versus long-term growth, and a very inconsistent narrative in terms of what you're trying to talk about. And so, I think those are all kind of contributing factors that some organizations really have to wrestle with. It's great to be responsive and reactive to real circumstances, and everybody knows how to hold a plan loosely, but what are the trade-offs in being able to shift from having a strategy and then suddenly realizing there needs to be an adjustment? They get very eager and excited about creating a lot of energy. That energy is great, but that energy may not be harnessed in such a way that it's actually going anywhere. So you're feeling good about the activity and the responsiveness, but you might be trading one problem for another if you don't have that clarity together as a team. And so I think it's this thing that often we all talk about of like go slow to go fast. Is really an opportunity that is presenting itself in a situation like that. Like before we move off of solve this problem in a particular way, let's pause and make sure we all know what we're trying to do here, and being able to accomplish that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for sharing all of that. That was a lot. Like within a within a past couple of minutes. I wanted to go back to something like you touched on it a little bit in the beginning, but it's certainly been my experience, and I'm curious to see how it's been over on your end. Do you think that a lot of these constraints? I mean, certainly a lot of it has to do with market dynamics, and as you said, like the introduction of AI and machine learning. But do you also feel? I mean, we're talking about B2B here, right? And a lot of these big companies, whether it's in healthcare or manufacturing or chemicals or whatever, when you have a meeting, you have this meeting with senior management or the board of directors, marketing is not always the first thing that comes to mind.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And I say that with a heavy heart, being a marketer, but you got to face the music, right? That's the reality of it. Do you feel that a lot of times, especially with small marketing teams, the reason why they're having to navigate these challenges is because people within the organization, A, don't quite understand what marketing is, and B, they don't quite understand why they should care?
Yes, I definitely would agree with you, and I think it's sometimes an educational problem, and sometimes it's a self-imposed problem.
Right.
And I think on to your point, it can be perceived as it looks easy, or it's easy to get educated or feel knowledgeable about. It's viewed sometimes more as an art form and very subjective, as opposed to a science and driven based on actual performance activities and good strategy. And then I think the marketers ourselves sometimes unintentionally have done that to ourselves. We've gotten very excited about a lot of things, maybe trends that are happening. Maybe we are just tied to the thrill of a great creative hook or message or whatever, and we miss the connectivity to the business itself. And with that in mind, you just become an outer ring in some of the core things that the organization is doing. And the other part of it is sometimes your role could get perceived just as responsible for help getting leads, as opposed to, hey, marketing's responsibility is to be a part of probably a lot of the ecosystem. Not only do we help acquire, we help keep. We help create an experience. We help create an experience for our employees, and so on and so forth. So, I think there's shared responsibility sometimes. Certainly, a world that's evolving. I think it's getting better. I think marketing has developed a more present seat in the C-suite and leadership conversations, which is positive. Plenty of runway to go yet. But then there's marketing themselves, making sure that, hey, these things that we do, are they aligned and connected to all of the things that are happening that the organization cares about? Are their goals our goals, as opposed to, hey, we'll just increase likes and shares and so on? Those are all good numbers for marketing. Maybe they don't equate to the business, and therefore we sometimes shut ourselves outside of that conversation, as opposed to maybe how they perceive us.
Absolutely. I had another golden apple for you, but I'm gonna save that one for later on in the conversation.
All right.
Moving on to the next question, just based on everything that you've said, and we are talking about how smaller teams can optimize campaigns. What are some of these key pitfalls you would say they need to avoid? And to keep it constructive, we also need to talk about what they should be doing instead.
One of the things as I thought about that question was really, we often look at it as a capacity. Are we just running a few people ragged? And there could be some truth to that. But I think the greater risk would be just, are we going about it in all the wrong ways, right? There is a sense of urgency we go running out of the room. We want to help, but by nature of our activity and or the group's conversation that we're having, we actually could unintentionally just be creating an added level of chaos to the chaos that's there. And so some of those pitfalls could be chasing immediate pipeline and ignoring the long-term gain. And so, it's a both and strategy that we're trying to educate on and maintain is, hey, how do we make sure we answer the bell on some of the more immediate issues that are going on, but that we also don't do it at the expense of the long-term importance and success of this organization as well. Another one is constant strategic repositioning. If what we do is go after some of the more immediate things, and that could be looking like a sale or a sale price or something else that's commodifies the product and service that they offer, that might get them a bump in the moment, but is that the identity that the organization and its products really want to be known for? And so it may do damage to its long-term narrative, depending on how some of the messaging comes out at that time as well. I think there's a risk of overcomplicating what you're trying to do. And I think that's something that's stuck in my mind. I'm probably by nature an oversimplifier or a simplifier, I should say. And I think there's a risk of throwing a lot of things on the menu, looking at them as like 1,000 bets. And, at least one of these bets is going to turn into something. So, it feels like good activity. People feel good that there's a response is happening. But it may be such a scatter, and it may so minimize the level of effort on a variety of different things, that it just minimizes the challenge that's going on. And I think indirectly in doing that, you also may broaden the gap and divide between yourself and marketing and some of the other groups, including sales. So, hey, we're going to go do this thing, and we feel really good about it. Maybe it even does the thing that we think it should do. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really satiate some of the other drivers and motivators that they have. And so suddenly you've really got this growing divide as opposed to a closing divide in terms of what's going on. And so, I think those all become kind of risks in this whole thing. And then, maybe the last thing being taking risks on things you haven't done before. So suddenly it's, well, let's try this technology solution. Let's let AI do a thing for us or whatever. And when it's most critical, you're moving away from the things that you can believe in and trust the most, and you're throwing a few Hail Marys down the field. It could be a risk that is of too great for the organization, as opposed to, hey, what are some fundamental things that we can really hone in on? What is maybe more how we narrow our efforts into much more focused activities and energies, and what are our best executions? So, I think with the best of intentions, and I'm sure I'm as guilty as anybody at times in my past, of let's create a lot of activity. Potentially, that's the pressure you're feeling. The real answer may be, how do we stop enough to create clarity, really reset our pathway to what we need to accomplish, and then what's the most smartest and most effective way to get there?
Absolutely. I almost feel like sometimes as marketers, we're guilty of like, okay, let's just try everything, right? Like, or
Seems fun.
Or some teams, and I've certainly worked with some of them in the past. They get pressure, and especially in B2B, they get pressure from higher ups saying, "Well, I saw something on Sunday. Like there was this video. So why don't we do a video, right? why don't we get on TikTok?" And I had a briefing, and I shall not disclose the name of the client, but we had a briefing many years ago where a client said, "We want you to create a viral video for us." And to which I said, like, with all due respect, that you don't get to decide that.
Yeah, let's make magic, right?
Let's make magic, and I can say with confidence, we walked away from that and said, we can't help you. We walked away from that, and unscathed, right?
It's the hardest thing to do sometimes, right? But
Absolutely.
it is wise at times to recognize that.
Well, and I'm sure you'll agree. You'll agree with me when I say this. I mean, like, we've been in this business for a bit, but it's sometimes necessary to tell the client that, okay, you're asking us to do something for you, and I'm gonna like disagree with what you're asking us to do because we believe to our core that that's not in your best interest.
Right.
And it's difficult to have that conversation. I'm sure you've had many of them, right?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's
Yeah.
you're paying for our candor,
Yeah.
and I think the risk would be uh, arrogance. But I think for the most part, I think with the relationship that you're trying to build and forecasting that at times, that can be a healthy thing too. And even if it's a little challenging or impassioned, hopefully there's a point where you can reconcile some of those things. But I agree with you. There's a time and a place.
There's a time and a place. Absolutely. This next question is going to sound a little bit like table stakes to you, but man, I have worked with a lot of teams where that wasn't very clear. The importance of having a deep understanding of who your target groups are, and I'm going to say plural because it's never just one group in B2B, and an understanding of their buyer's journey. Right? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of things that really popped up
Hmm.
as I thought about that particular category. And to your point, it's a complex group, and yet I think this is also really a time where precision is important. When you start looking at urgent shifts and that kind of a thing. And so, not to eliminate groups necessarily, but hey, if we need to prioritize, how do we prioritize some of these things along the way? And one of the other things that was tied to this as well is I think sometimes when the client feels a sense of urgency, there can be pressure on the time it takes to be clear about some of these things. And one of the things that's challenged us to do is, hey, we're not going to skip that step, but maybe we can come up with, not a strategy that takes weeks and months, but maybe we just need to develop a sprint session together. And that's really forced us to be a little more streamlined ourselves. Don't skip the step, but let's make sure we have a smart way of creating some clarity around those things. And so that's a little bit of a learning curve that we've worked our way through. Is hey, sometimes you get the strategy is the project, and a lot of times the strategy is a necessary component to get to the goals and the outcomes that they have. And so one of the things that I first jotted down was this idea of precision beats volume. And so it's this, hey, how do we create clarity in terms of where's our best focus, best energy? How do we target where the real pain is to get the best value? How do we prioritize high propensity accounts and opportunities and those kinds of things along the way? So that was kind of step one. Let's make sure we've got some clarity around the focus of that, and then don't confuse the buying committee as well. To your point, it's like you could have leadership, C-suite. You're going to have probably a finance person involved. You might have procurement. You might have the end user. Those are all very different drivers and motives in that whole thing. And so I think making sure we have clear lanes on some of that, so we don't muddy this into such a chaotic thing. We forget that they have to want this product along the way. So I think there's importance to that. And again, a lot of times that comes back to that early stage of a sprint. How do you then align messaging to decision stages? I think we all wrestle with this whole thing. They're going to love it as soon as they hear it, and they'll say yes right away.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. Back to your buyer's journey conversation again, to kind of say, hey, how do we move through a series of stages of experience where first they become aware of it, then they learn to engage with it and be well informed about what it can do. See reinforcement, see the data that supports it, and those things happen in timely phases. And so this right place, right time, right message component is critical to a lot of the sequencing that happens. And we're all guilty of periodically thinking this will be a one call close type of interaction, when in reality the decision making is probably going the other direction over time. They're risk averse. They're not going to make wild decisions. They're probably going to have multiple layers of approval. They're going to have other players in consideration often as well, and that's just a reality that I think the world has to be more and more prepared for as we lose expertise and knowledge as people retire and those kinds of things. People are going to go to the internet and these other places to begin the research process all over again. And so it will take a very different approach to being able to do that. And then a few other things that I noted is, again, just continuing to build that sales and marketing alignment. Who is that primary audience? Does everybody agree? Do we all see the journey the same? Are we hitting that prospect with the right things at the right time? And then how do we make sure that we're continuing to protect long-term equity and what we're trying to do as well? So, it'll continue to stay fairly important. And so even as the process may becomes faster in some of these situations because the circumstances demand it, skipping the steps is probably the way to get off track. And so really kind of helping everybody stay focused, stay purposeful, be clear on the targets are still things that I think are immutables in making changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have this conversation with marketers a lot. Like, I always highly encourage them, like, have you sat in on sales calls? Um, Back in the day when I was starting out, I had to go out into the field with the salespeople, right? As an observer. So I'm just like the fly on the wall there, right? But listening to the way that they would um, present the company's products and solutions to the prospect, how they would handle the objections and the concerns and whatnot of said prospect, and if there was an issue there, okay, so how can we address that? Because it's not always necessarily the salesperson's fault per se, right? um, and it's that whole concept of like the way that we're going to make this work is if we do it together, right? And having that good relationship or having that close relationship with the salespeople, I think, is a vital component of that, right? Because otherwise, like you said, it's going to be like everything is in silos, and marketing is going to like develop all these messages in isolation, and it's not going to work.
Doesn't say anything, or whatever they might observe about the materials. But you're right. I think
Right.
if it's more of a partnership
Yeah,
and mutual education of the
yeah,
other, I think there's a lot more potential for exponential outcomes as opposed to siloed solutions.
yep, absolutely. All right, I'm going to ask you two sets of questions here, and there's plenty to unpack. So just take a deep breath, right? Because this next question is about how small teams can leverage constraints to drive that clarity, that alignment, and focused execution. So, what are the steps that they need to take? What are some of those critical components that they need to throw into the mix?
A few things that we've already talked about, but I think are worth repeating. As far as key steps for small groups, I think ruthlessly defining who. I think it can become much easier to start focusing on yourselves and navel gazing, if you will. And so I think continuing to really think about who is that ideal client, what do they need, what's the problem we're solving, is really important. And that's really the second one of clarify the core problem. What urgent, high values thing are we really focused on, especially if the pressure's on right now, right? Who is it? What's the context? How do we make sure that we're really focused on them in terms of what we do? And then what are the most important priorities that surround that? And again, I think really just making sure we narrow in. We don't dilute, but we do focus, and so I think there is going to be even a necessary conversation that might say, hey, we have an opportunity of this broad audience group, but who is our best and strongest environment? What are the best efforts that we can put forward towards helping them and supporting them? Then I said, build one narrative platform, not many campaigns. I think we've come out of a world at times where, hey, we do quarterly campaigns or whatever kind of a thing, and so we use it like Kleenex and kind of move to another one and another one. And I think in the era that we're in, because of the diversity of tools and therefore the types of interactions that people have, building more of a platform of, hey, what is this offering that we have? How does it align to the individual? What are the core individual messages that we have? It still gives you a lot of latitude for mixing some of those pillars and those messages together. I quite often will illustrate to clients that as we're developing positioning in different pillars, I almost look at it like a soundboard in a recording studio where, hey, you've got all these knobs and buttons to push. And depending on the application and the moment of interaction and those kinds of things, we can turn up and turn down those core components and create a lot of different attributes and experiences around that whole thing, but they're still the same core things. And so if anybody feels like, as we narrow a little bit, that it's going to get boring, I think it's actually just the opposite. It creates a much richer experience, but it's all much more coordinated as well. So I think that's very much an opportunity, is make sure there's a platform approach, creates a lot more consistency, a lot more longevity, and therefore a lot more opportunity to stick over time with the audience that you're trying to reach. And then I think, metrics, as we continue to talk about metrics, make sure that we have a shared way to evaluate what we're doing, and is it working? And there's a lot of different metrics that can go into that. And then I think it's keep the cycle tight. Once things are in the marketplace, how do we continue to be able to circle back with regularity to say what is this getting us? Is this doing the thing? And is it a thing we can reinvest in, or it is an adjustment that we can work our way through? But continuing to be able to do that in as close to real time as you can. So that you're working together. You'd hate to kind of disappear for 90 days, show back up, and then say, hey, look, it didn't work, or vice versa. And I think it just allows, again, a much more team-minded approach to being able to do this, or at least being able to share status and that kind of a thing, depending on what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially as marketers, you never want to give people the impression that you're running an art studio here. You lock yourself up there for 2 weeks, and then I'm working on my masterpiece. It's not quite done yet, right?
Yep.
It really does need to be a two-way street, because you can attest to this, and I've gone through plenty of campaigns as well where it almost becomes this weekly check-in sometimes, depending on the client, right? Sometimes it's bi-weekly, right? But okay, so this is how it's going. This is the progress so far. This is where we're seeing some obstacles, and this is how we're planning to address those, right? So it's continuously evolving. I think you brought it up earlier. It's an ecosystem.
Yeah, right? Very much. I agree.
Yeah. All right. So here comes the question of the hour. So with the reality of tight budgets and even tighter deadlines, marketing teams need to be more resourceful and agile. So this is one of those what would you do situations, right? So Jordan, if you had a smaller marketing team and the senior management only gave you 90 days to deliver results, what would you do? So talk us through the process and what approach you would use, what initiatives you'd implement.
Well, somewhat similar to our own process, we have something we call the DDM way, and the first phase of that starts with listening and understanding. And so I had written down a phase for this that would be, diagnose and focus in a situation like this. Again, I think this go slow to go fast mindset, where you can kind of identify the best path, analyze the pipeline and have those conversations and get aligned with sales. I think those are the core components that have to be there, or I think you're going to continue to be battling the execution side of things down the road. And so I think phase one is very foundational, of really diagnose, focus. Phase two, I said, activate you're a focused revenue engine. So precision over scale, I think is really the thing that you've heard me say a number of times is, who are we targeting? Is it almost account-based focused or something similar? What will strengthen our conversion assets. We've been talking a little bit about that in terms of what are those best tools? Are they case studies? Are they white papers? Are they various other sheets that need to get created? Then building that platform, and again, it may get executed as a campaign still, but your platform has more of a longer life to it. And then optimize the channels that you're using and really making sure you're doing all the right things that are there. And then I think once you've got it in the market, the last phase of this whole thing is double down and then optimize or amplify at that point. So we're big believers in terms of setting up some things that you can see regular metrics and performance on. And then we usually will talk with our clients as well about, hey, what are the things we need to talk about if we're going to make a change? And what are the things you should be expecting us just to go ahead and make adjustments on the fly that are supportive? And usually if there's shifts in terms of approach or message or something, we need to talk. If it's, hey, let's move our mixture of maybe a media placement or something like that within the budget we already have, those are things they might expect us to go after and really make sure we're keeping this thing optimized. And sometimes I respectfully describe our resources on the media side as almost like day traders. The tools are there. We should be paying attention on a regular basis, looking at performance and then optimizing for them when and where we can along the way. And that's the beauty of some of the digital tools that are out there. There's always risks in over adjusting or over manipulating, but I think there's very much an opportunity for us to stay very up on how everything is performing.
Fantastic. So, all right. So we've got the clarity, we've got the alignment, we've got the understanding of the target audience and the buyer's journey, and now you've laid out your plan for the 90 days. And now the board is going to say, well, that's all well and good, Jordan, but we need to see the ROI, right? What are we spending money on here? And I'm sure you've had that conversation before, because I've certainly have. And then what I'm getting at here is, like, what kind of metrics should these marketing teams be paying attention to prove that whatever it is they're implementing is working?
I think, the things that probably made this conversation happen in the first place are probably the first metrics you got to have. So it probably has something to do with revenue, and probably secondly has to do with how quality they think the pipeline is filled with opportunities. And so I think, your initial metrics that would say this is working or not working really have to start there. And it may be 2 or 3 steps removed from some of the, inside marketing measurements that might be there. But at the end of the day, that's what will kind of matter to them. And so what is, the pipeline contribution looking like? What kind of opportunity creation rate is happening? Revenue influence, those kinds of things I think are components that matter when we talk about revenue and pipeline. Is are we actually contributing to the financial success of the organization? Then you can start dropping down and get closer and closer into some of your more specialty focused areas and that kind of a thing. I think then you get into stage conversions, leads to opportunities to proposals closed won. I think those are very traditional funnels, and those are great things to have. I think those ladder up to some of the other things that we previously talked about. Sales cycle length, maybe another one. Win rates. Those are all really great things between sales and marketing to be able to say these things are starting to actually work. And then you get into things like efficiency rates and those kinds of things. Now you're getting into probably platform-specific performances, cost per opportunities, cost per clicks, cost, so on and so forth. You're probably getting into more marketing-specific measurements. You could get all the way over to the brand side and start talking about messaging and market signals that you're creating as well. Those are probably inside in your world, and there may be some ahas that you can really push back up to say, hey, giving you some forecasting here. Here's what's happening. People are starting to respond in this way to these particular messages. This is something that should be on our watch list because it could be an opportunity. It could be a threat, and a way it goes there as well. So it's important to probably keep those things connected. But I think we have a tendency, and I know we've been as guilty as anybody somewhere in our past, where you start from the bottom and you work your way up. And so you dazzle them with SEO information and search statistics and social media information, and you have somebody probably drumming their fingers across the table, kind of going, we're bleeding money, or whatever the story could be. This isn't meeting the conversation that we need to have. And so I think we need to start and meet them and then be able to work our way down. And I think then the marketing connectivity, also one of the things you and I talked about at the beginning, will start to come back to them like, oh, these guys understand what we're motivated to do. And they're now starting to contribute to the solutions that we're trying to accomplish here. We're on to something now. We're a team. We're not adversaries trying to find out who's responsible for success or lack of. So,
absolutely, and yeah, like you said, it boils down to like revenue and pipeline contribution, right? Like,
yeah,
everything else after that is probably secondary.
Well, and again, we love to kind of show people some really neat things, but it's kind of like, if you just told me about barometric pressure as opposed to, is it going to be stormy or is it going to be sunny today, kind of a thing. It's like, you need something that you can do something with. And I think you have to look at that leadership group with that in mind from a marketing standpoint. So
That's it. Okay. Here comes the soapbox question. So a status quo in your area of expertise that you passionately disagree with, and why?
Yeah, there was a couple different thoughts that were coming through my mind. And I think, this idea that marketing exists just to facilitate leads for a couple of different reasons. I think I think it's a means to an end that I think is a little limiting. It confuses the activity with the impact a little bit more. I think that's an element of something that, again, I'll use the magic word of ecosystem. It's a contributing ingredient as opposed to something that's done in isolation. And so, certainly kind of wrestle with that a little bit more. I think the more we talk about it just being a responsibility to generate leads, the more we don't leave room for the things that we know are critical ingredients, like brand, like the experience of working with the organization and or using the product.
Yes.
Those kinds of things could really derail if all we want to do is acquire. That's your only job. And I think there's a lot of organizations that are starting to realize, we do a lot of work in healthcare. So that's an example close to my mind where, you can do a lot of work acquiring, but if we don't do a great job of giving them a great experience, even down to billing, especially in healthcare world, there's just as great a likelihood we're going to need twice as many leads and opportunities if we keep losing them on the back end. And so I think marketing plays a more and more significant role in a number of fronts in terms of creating those experiences, so that not just the buyer's journey, but the customer experience are accounted for in those things. And so I think it's a good thing. We need to be responsible for that role. Certainly, if we don't grow, there's consequences. So we want to contribute to generating leads and generating new business. But I think we need to be, hey, is marketing accounted for in a lot of the different components of our organization? I think that's a much more holistic mindset that organizations are doing more and more, to their credit. Certainly don't need to pick on them or anything like that. I think the world is evolving just as much as the marketing discipline itself is.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very multifaceted, right? Like in every aspect, right? So it's yeah, perhaps a certain part of it is lead gen, but there's so much more than that.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree. I
Right.
agree. There's so many
Yeah.
things definitely you could label in there, but I think that's probably the one is to be a more active participant in everything the organization is doing is should be expected as much as they should be included. So it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also just to build on what you said, especially ever since I started out my career in marketing, it's to get people, and this is part of the reason why I started the show. It's to get people to understand, people in the non-marketing role to understand that marketing does have a strategic role,
Yeah,
right? And
very
just
much.
because perhaps they don't understand that right now, that doesn't mean it should be ignored,
Right.
right? Right?
Totally agree.
Yeah, yeah. Jordan, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise and experience with the listeners. Please, quick introduction to yourself and how folks out there can get in touch with you.
Sure. I'm Jordan Buning from DDM Marketing and Communications. Officially, considered the visionary of the organization, if you know EOS,
Right.
but also involved very heavily on sales and strategy with a lot of our clients. You can reach DDM at teamddm.com. Or my email address is Jordan B, Jordan, B as in boy, at
Mhm.
teamddm.com.
Fantastic, fantastic. And we'll be sure to drop all that information in the show notes when the episode comes out.
Sounds great.
Once again, Jordan, thanks so much for your time. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon.
Thank you. Appreciate
All
it.
right. Thanks. Bye for now.